As a matter of emphatic principle, Badiou's philosophy is designed to be as indifferent as possible to the language in which it is conveyed. Most of the problems encountered in translating Eletic concern only its remarkable concision and frequent abstraction. There are just a few terms and stylistic choices that deserve special mention. With Badiou's consent, and for the sake of clarity, I have distinguished the always singular ethic of truths Eletic de verités from ethics Eletic in its conventional, and here pejorative, sense. Every other important element of Badiou's terminology, truth processes de verité, event, subject, being, situation, fidelity, void vidi, has been translated as literally as possible, even when, as occasionally with void and fidelity, these terms jar with normal English usage. I have had recourse to the slightly clumsy neologism evental to translate his use of the word evenential, which has little to do with either the conventional meaning of factual or the connotation made famous by Fernand Braudel and the Annals approach to historiography. To my mind, the more natural choice of eventful by Mataraz and Burkill in their translations of Badiou's Manifesto and Delos invites misleading associations, plenitude, bustle, familiarity, while simply to adopt the French word as is, on the model of Lacan's jouissance, would be to concede too much to those principles of linguistic constructivism and particularism that Badiou's universalism so vigorously rejects. An ensemble is usually translated by mathematicians as a set, and I have generally followed suit. The reader should remember, however, that the English word loses the notion of being together or collectivity implied by the French. The awkward-sounding multiple being translates Badiou's être multiple, which is synonymous with what he analyzes, in l'être l'événement, as pure being qua being l'être en tant qu'être. This refers to the being of any indifferent thing considered in isolation from its every substantial or describable quality, that is, being reduced to purely ontological characteristics, which Badiou equates with the characteristics of multiplicity as such. Readers of French will be familiar with the double meaning of the word droit, both law and right, as in human right, though the context has usually encouraged its translation as right or rights, it is in large part the legal orientation of the term that attracts Badiou's scorn. The words penser and pensée are more difficult to render in suitably solemn English, to conceive, to conceptualize, and so on, are all off the mark, and for all their apparent naivete, to think and thought are usually the only viable options. It should be remembered that for Badiou, thinking is an activity reserved to the field of truths, and it should never be confused with the effectively thoughtless expression of recognized opinions or the state-driven manipulation of representations. Finally, for the sake of syntactical simplicity and with apologies to readers irritated by such conventions, I have preserved the standard French use of masculine pronouns and the generic term man l'homme or l'homme. Translators' notes have been kept to a minimum, and are distinguished by enclosure in square brackets. All other notes are Badiou's own. Thanks to all those who helped with the translation, Sepide Anber, Gillian Beaumont, Patrick Ferenc, Cecile Laborde, Sinead Rushy, John Taylor, and of course, Alain Badiou himself. The story of this book is peculiar. It actually began as a commission, as part of a series aimed at secondary school and university students. I agreed to write it out of friendship for the men behind the project, Benoit Chanter, one of today's few editors worthy of the name. I wrote it in the countryside, in the summer of 1993, in the space of 2 weeks, stimulated by a constant stream of phone calls from this same Benoit Chanter. My approach at the time thus conformed to that of an exercise whose rules are imposed from the outside, a fixed word limit, the need to remain accessible to a non-specialized readership, the obligation to refer to current affairs, and so on. All the same, the real difficulty lay elsewhere. It sprang from a contradictory state of mind. On the one hand, I was driven by a genuine fury. The world was deeply plunged in ethical delirium. Everyone was busily confusing politics with the hypocrisy of a mindless catechism. The intellectual counter-revolution, in the form of moral terrorism, was imposing the infamies of Western capitalism as the new universal model. The presumed rights of man were serving at every point to annihilate any attempt to invent forms of free thought. As a result, my book became something of a pamphlet. On a number of occasions my editor and friend had to ask me to tone down my invective. On the other hand, however, some of the questions raised in the book called for a subtle and inventive discipline of thought. I had still not yet drawn all the practical consequences, and ethical consequences, for that matter, of the ontology of truths I had put forward 5 years earlier, in l'être l'événement, 1988, so that even for me, a good number of the points developed in the present book were new and uncertain. I was thus caught between the simplifying temptations of the pamphleteer and the necessary rigor of conceptual innovation. The solution, if it was a solution, was to dilute the ideological fury bit by bit over the course of the philosophical construction. As it stands, the book begins as a political attack against the ideology of human rights, and as a defense of the anti-humanism of the 1960s. It closes by sketching an ethic of truths, in which I distinguish from the human animal, whose rights are not easily identified, the subject as such, the subject understood as the local fragment of a truth procedure, and as the immortal creation of an event. What is most surprising is that this slightly strange combination of fighting against the ideological current, moralism, a generalized victimization, was at the time a matter of consensus, and conceptual schematization enjoyed considerable success, not least in secondary schools. To date, along with Manifesto for Philosophy, Ethics is my best-selling book. As sometimes happens, a good many people were grateful that I had taken the risk of saying frankly something that is uncomfortable to say. And these same people, and perhaps others too, also know that I take this risk only from the standpoint of a genuine philosophical enterprise, for truly pressing reasons, and not simply to draw attention to myself. The truth is, incidentally, that I am much too shy to enjoy drawing attention to myself. Today I can look at this book, which came out almost 7 years ago, from 2 different angles, that of the ideological polemic, and that of the theoretical construction. As regards the first angle, I have no regrets. We have since had to endure the intervention of Western bombers against Serbia, the intolerable blockade of Iraq, the continuation of threats against Cuba. All of this is still legitimate by a quite unbelievable outpouring of moralizing sermons. The International Tribunal is clearly prepared to arrest and try, in the name of human rights, anyone, anywhere, who attempts to contest the new world order of which NATO, i.e. the United States, is the armed guard. Today, our democratic totalitarianism is all the more firmly entrenched. It is now more necessary than ever that those with free minds rise up against this servile way of thinking, against this miserable moralism in the name of which we are obliged to accept the prevailing way of the world and its absolute injustice. The most that can be said is that perhaps the consensus is slowly weakening. The intervention against Serbia did at least provoke a debate which never really took place regarding Bosnia or Iraq. American imperialism and European servility are denounced more often now than they were a few years ago. To be sure, the enemy, comforted by the collapse of authoritarian socialism, dominates everywhere. But it is also true that we are entering into a long period of recomposition, both for emancipatory political thought and for those effective practical forces that correspond to it. We are in a position to declare, as the complementary watchwords of this recomposition, the two essential prescriptions of the day, the dissolution of NATO, and the disbanding of the International Court of Human Rights. As for the theoretical construction, it must be said that the ideas of this little book, although they are orientated in the right direction, constitute no more than a preliminary sketch. I am currently in the process of developing them, and sometimes modifying them, with respect to at least 4 points. 1. The concept of situation is especially important, since I maintain that there can be no ethics in general, but only an ethic of singular truths, and thus an ethic relative to a particular situation. I now accept that a situation cannot be understood simply as a multiple, i.e. as a set. We must also take into account the network of relations it sustains, which involves making sense of the way a multiple appears in the situation. This means that a situation must be conceived as both, in its being, a pure multiple, in keeping with the argument of l'événement, and, in its appearing, as the effect of a transcendental legislation. All this will be developed in my forthcoming book, entitled Logiques du monde, Logics of the World, which I conceive as the sequel to l'événement. Today I can no longer maintain that the only trace left by an event in the situation it affects is the name given to that event. This idea presumed, in effect, that there were two events rather than one, the event and the event naming, and likewise two subjects rather than one, the subject who names the event, and the subject who is faithful to this naming. So I now posit that an event is implicative, in the sense that it enables the detachment of a statement which will subsist as such once the event itself has disappeared. This statement was previously undecided, or of an uncertain value. When it takes place, the event decides its value, it determines its truthfulness and, in so doing, modifies the entire logic of the situation, its entire transcendental regime. Here again, in other words, the ontological theory of the event needs to be completed by a logical theory. These points were developed in detail in my seminars of 1996 to 97 and 1997 to 98, and will be reworked in Logiques du monde. 3. The subject cannot be conceived exclusively as the subject faithful to the event. This point in particular has significant ethical implications. For I was previously unable to explain the appearance of reactionary innovations. My whole theory of the new confined it to the truth procedures. But when all is said and done, it is obvious that reaction, and even the powers of death, can be stamped with the creative force of an event. I had already emphasized the fact that Nazism was inexplicable without reference to communism, and more precisely to the Revolution of October 1917. I was then obliged to admit that the event opens a subjective space in which not only the progressive and truthful subjective figure of fidelity but also other figures every bit as innovative, albeit negative, such as the reactive figure, or the figure I call the obscure subject, take their place. For the trajectory of the truth, finally, should not be referred back solely to the multiple consistency of the situation, nor to its encyclopedia of knowledges. We need to understand how it deals with logical transformations. This brings us back to the question of how truths appear, whereas up to this point I had considered only their being, i.e. the fact that truths are generic multiplicities. So you can see that the theoretical basis of the present book has evolved somewhat. But to my mind it remains solid enough on the essential points, and still offers an introduction that is both lively and coherent to a far-reaching enterprise which, I hope, will redefine what is at stake in contemporary philosophy. I do not want to end without thanking both Verso, for their intellectual and political commitment, and Peter Hallward, who is a genuine friend, and all the more so since he often disagrees with my theories. Alain, Badiou, April 2000. Certain scholarly words, after long confinement in dictionaries and in academic prose, have the good fortune, or the misfortune, a little like an old maid who, long since resigned to her fate, suddenly becomes, without understanding why, the toast of the town, of sudden exposure to the bright light of day, of being plebeian publicized, press released, televised, even mentioned in government speeches. The word ethics, which smacks so strongly of philosophy courses and its Greek root, which evokes Aristotle, the Nicomachean Ethics, one of the great bestsellers, has today taken center stage. Ethics concerns, in Greek, the search for a good way of being, for a wise course of action. On this account, ethics is a part of philosophy, that part which organizes practical existence around representation of the good. The Stoics were no doubt the most dedicated of those who made of ethics not only a part of philosophical wisdom but its very core. The wise man is he who, able to distinguish those things which are his responsibility from those which are not, restricts his will to the former while impassively enduring the latter. We attribute to the Stoics, moreover, the custom of comparing philosophy to an egg whose shell is logic, whose white is physics, and whose yolk is ethics. With the moderns, for whom, since Descartes, the question of the subject has been central, ethics is more or less synonymous with morality, or, as Kant would say, with practical reason, as distinguished from theoretical reason. It is a matter of how subjective action and its representable intentions relate to a universal law. Ethics is the principle that judges the practice of a subject, be it individual or collective. Hegel will introduce a subtle distinction between ethics Sittlichkeit and morality moralitat. He reserves the application of the ethical principle to immediate action, while morality is to concern reflexive action. He will say, for example, that the ethical order essentially consists in the immediate firmness of decision. Point 1. The contemporary return to ethics uses the word in an obviously fuzzy way, but one that is certainly closer to Kant, the ethics of judgment, than to Hegel, the ethics of decision. In fact, ethics designates today a principle that governs how we relate to what is going on, a vague way of regulating our commentary on historical situations, the ethics of human rights, technico-scientific situations, medical ethics, bioethics, social situations, the ethics of being together, media situations, the ethics of communication, and so on. This norm of commentaries and opinions is backed up by official institutions, and carries its own authority. We now have national ethical commissions, nominated by the state. Every profession questions itself about its ethics. We even deploy military expeditions in the name of the ethics of human rights. With respect to today's socially inflated recourse to ethics, the purpose of this essay is twofold. To begin with, I will examine the precise nature of this phenomenon, which is the major philosophical tendency of the day, as much in public opinion as for our official institutions. I will try to establish that in reality it amounts to a genuine nihilism, a threatening denial of thought as such. I will then argue against this meaning of the term ethics, and propose a very different one. Rather than link the word to abstract categories, man or human, right or law, the other, it should be referred back to particular situations. Rather than reduce it to an aspect of pity for victims, it should become the enduring maxim of singular processes. Rather than make of it merely the province of conservatism with a good conscience, it should concern the destiny of truths, in the plural.